Brilliant, excellent. Well, thank you very much, everybody, for joining us on this panel discussion. What we are going to be discussing this morning is emerging audit trends and challenges. And I'm really pleased that we have 4 individuals, 2 from financial services firms, 2 from healthcare, manufacturing and chemical tech firms, joining us on this panel. My name is Deepak Tahim. I'm one of the associate directors here at MetricStream. Been with the business now for 3 years, but been within GRC for the last 8. And what I would like to do is to introduce the panel members one by one and get them to provide a very quick summary of themselves. So, Steve, can I kick off with yourself? Steve Humphreys, Senior VP, Internal Audit from Smith & Nephew PLC.
Thank you very much. Head of Audit for Smith & Nephew. If you haven't heard of Smith & Nephew, if you ever have problems in the future with your knees or your hips, perhaps we can help you. It's not the kind of thing you can do to yourself over a weekend, but we manufacture medical devices and also other appliances or products to help wounds heal. I've been with Smith & Nephew for since March, so quite new to the company. Prior to that, I was with SAB Miller, big beer company, head of audit there for about 7 years. They got taken over last year. And then prior to that, I was head of audit for Wolseley. So I've been a head of audit for FTSE and 40 and bigger companies for about the last 14 years, I think. It sounds like a life sentence and I should have been released for good behaviour, but it's a bit about me.
Great, thank you, Steve. And then Jana Chapman, who's the Chief Auditor at Nationwide Building Society.
Hi, I've been with Nationwide since just January. We're the world's largest mutual, serving 15 million members, helping people to buy their homes and keep their savings safe. Before that, I was with Citigroup, was there for a couple of years, and before that, I lived over in the States and worked with other financial services firms, Charles Schwab and the Bank of Tokyo and Mitsubishi. I began my life as a chartered accountant in the now defunct Arthur Andersen, and spent many years as an integration consultant with Accenture. So I moved into the audit business around 17 years ago, so my sentence is apparently slightly longer than yours.
Excellent. And just kind of moving on from that line of Citi, we've also joined by Chaya Gupta, who's the Audit Director of Citi. Maybe you can introduce yourself.
Hello, I'm Chief Technology Auditor for Citigroup's institutional businesses. In my role, I provide third line of defense coverage for technology risks across all of Citi's wholesale banking activities, private banking, investment banking, trade treasury solutions, transaction banking, and sales and trading. Prior to Citi, I worked for UBS. I see some faces here from UBS. Pleased to see them. I worked for Deutsche Bank, largely leading risk control audit functions in a number of geographies. I've lived and worked in India, South Korea, Switzerland, and the UK.
Excellent, thank you very much. And then lastly, but not, it's Angela O'Hara, who's a Risk and Audit Director at Johnson
Matthey. I've been at Johnson Matthey for 3 years. It's a company that is into manufacturing, and we manufacture goods using clever chemistry across the automotive, pharmaceutical and oil and gas sector. I've been there for 3 years. Prior to that, I was in a very different industry. I spent 14 years at Vodafone. My professional background, and when I joined Vodafone, I was actually a tax person. So I spent my first sort of 10 years at Vodafone in tax and then switched over to audit and clearly loved it so much that I'm still an auditor.
So many years of audit experience that we've got on the panel, which is great. What we are going to be doing on this panel is kind of running through a couple of questions just to talk about experiences around the changing role of chief audit execs, etc. What I would ask is we'll open up for questions at the end of the session. So please note down any questions that you may have. We'll open it out at the end of the session for questions. So the first question that I'm going to ask is actually of Janet, which is, how do you see the chief audit exec role changing? What are the key responsibilities of them now as opposed to what they were previously? And what are the key changes that you've seen across a number of years?
Well, I'll take this question from a financial services perspective because in many ways the role of the Chief Audit Executive has changed an awful lot. And in other ways it hasn't changed at all. Over the last 10, 15 years, there's been a lot more focus on structuring risk management frameworks and making a lot more clarity around the 3 lines of defense in the financial services space, which has, on the face of it, made some changes to the way in which we operate. But I think at its core, our role hasn't changed. It's still about providing assurance on controls to our boards, to our executives, to our other stakeholders. In my case, it's to our members. It might be shareholders. It's to regulators. But I think there has been a big change in how that gets done. In the financial services space, we are very strictly regulated now. Every global regulator has, to some degree or another, prescribed what internal audit needs to do beyond the fact of its existence. And I think probably to the extreme, it's in the US, where the OCC and the Federal Reserve have regulated things down to what you need to provide to your audit committee every time you do a report. So in some ways, it's very much more strictly regulated. Reporting lines are regulated. The skills and capabilities of the chief audit executive are regulated. But I think when I sort of reflected back on this question, what occurred to me was, whilst the mechanics are somewhat different, it's actually in the context of the role and what's expected of it that has really formulated somewhat differently. And that we're measured now not really by the number of reports that we produce, but the amount of impact and influence that we have on the organization. You'll find that chief audit executives, and I think this is true across all industries, are now much more routinely sitting at the executive committee with the senior executives, are in on the conversation, are sitting at the table, which gives us the challenge of having a voice. If you're in the room, you've got to have a voice, but still needing to remain independent and not participating in business decisions. It means you need to have a view on any number of different topics, which has really meant that, in a way, perhaps at one time it was possible for internal audit to exist somewhat over to the side. You really need to have a fantastic network, both internally and externally, that's keeping you fully informed and engaged about what's going on in an organization. In that context, you need to be able to place a challenge and hold your nerve, to take a contrary opinion and to be willing to hold on to it if you're convinced that it's supported by fact, and that the direction is the right one. And you also need to be able to get that voice heard. If any of you ever have a spare rainy Sunday afternoon, there's some entertaining reading in some of the congressional hearings around some of the large failed banks that took place. Those hearings took place in around sort of 2010, 2011. And you'll see in there just exactly what happens when second and third line find that they're unable to get their voices heard, where problems in those institutions were seen, were understood, but that voice was not heard and was overruled. So all of those sort of package up to me into something which means that our ability to make something different happen is very much to the forefront these days, and I think that's true across most industries. And then here in the UK, we are now a component of the senior managers regime, which governs the responsibilities of senior managers in financial services organisation. There are 22 of these roles. The internal audit is number 5. So I think that gives us a sense of where that ranks in terms of the importance in the eyes of our regulators that internal audit has in keeping our financial services system safe and sound.
Great. And from so that's really kind of from a financial services perspective. Steve, maybe I can ask you the question from a manufacturing perspective. Is it very different?
There aren't so many regulations around non-financial services, but actually a lot of what Jana has said resonates with me most certainly. I think I'll get to answering the question as a general sort of comment on the profession. I think internal audit has become much more professional over the last decade, 2 decades, although I still think there's a way to go. I think the Institute of Internal Auditors has done a good job in trying to drive the profession forward, but we as individuals need to do increasingly large amounts of work with our organisations, convincing them of what we can offer them. And I think, working for a number of different organisations, if you've got something that's of value to the organisation will buy into it. I think the head of audit in the last number of years has had to become much more front of house. You become almost a general manager now, as opposed to just a head of audit. You're an advisor, a counsellor to the business. You have to understand your stakeholders will have different needs. You've got to be clear about the distinction between execs and non-execs. You've got to behave appropriately for both and give them the information they need at the right time. That's terribly important. You've also got to be a great talent manager on the basis that internal auditors don't necessarily always stay with the audit function for the rest of their careers. One good thing is to have people move in and move out, and that's very important that people would measure you. That's one measure of success of internal audit. I think increasingly one of the things I've seen is that internal audit sometimes can be criticised for being very backwards looking. Oh yes, you saw something went wrong, and if only you'd been able to tell us before it went wrong, we'd all be in a better place. And internal audit these days, obviously you have to have a view to the past, but you've got to look at the present and the future, and that's really, really important, because sometimes in the past internal audit has tended to be happy to look at what's in front of it and therefore what's happened in the past. A lot of change is going on, but internal audit doesn't really influence that too much. Internal audit may come along and do a post-implementation review and tell everybody how badly the implementation went. If only you'd done this and only you'd done that. Internal audit actually, to do the job effectively, has now got to be looking at the future state of the organisation, making sure that if the organisation is going to go through change, it's going to create something in the future, which is the operating model, which will be the operating model today, but in the future, internal audit's got to be there right from the start and trying to advise management as much as is possible about what good looks like and how the organisation can move successfully forward. I think also internal audit, a key job of the head of internal audit is to make sure that where you are providing information, you're providing fact-based information. That's terribly important. So where you realise that there is a need for the organisation to do better, it is based on fact. And then the solutions that you offer are of value to the organisation. The solutions have been proved. So you've got to look outside the organisation more. That's through keeping a close relationship with your peers, but also then looking at market developments, and then also spending time analysing the results of prior audit activity. I know we all have done that, but that's critically important. So where you offer a solution, the solution is the safest bet for the organisation. You can actually prove that it's not out of a textbook, that actually you've seen the same situation somewhere else, internally or externally. A solution has been devised and the solution was implemented effectively. So I think, there's some of the things as a head of audit. It wasn't big bang though. I mean, if I've been doing this, I said I've been doing this for 14 years. It wasn't sort of suddenly one Monday morning I got up and thought I'm going to do it differently today. I was struggling before we started to think, well, if I went back 14 years to my first day as a head of audit for a FTSE 40, would I have been doing something different? And I can't recall there was anything that was significantly different. I think over the time you evolve, you change, you do things differently. But for non-financial services, there was never that one big moment where suddenly everything changed and you had to do something differently.
That's interesting. And then the other thing that's been noted from reports, I think the KPMG 2017 Pulse report kind of highlighted that risk management effectiveness is one of the key challenges that most audit committees are one of the key things for those audit committees. So I've got a question, maybe Angela, you can take this one, is, do you agree with that, and what are your views? What are the things that worry you from an audit perspective? And then specifically around that, what do you have to do from a resourcing perspective to align back to that?
So very much sort of focus of my audit committee at the moment, and also really the CFO and the CEO, is really looking at They call it auditing the second line. They want me to audit the first line as well. But effectively what they're looking at is management awareness and proactivity. And I have to say, actually, I coined that phrase from Lloyd's, who've been using that as well. So we do take things as well. And essentially what they are really looking at is not just identifying where there are control deficiencies, but they're interested in effectively mapping out the reporting lines up back to our sort of sector management. So my business is effectively structured. It's about sort of 90 small, medium businesses across a different location that all sort of roll up into 4 sectors. And we've got a fairly small group function as well, so very small ethics and compliance team. So lots of activity pushed into these sectors. And effectively, as we move more to a matrix environment, they're really wanting to know were they aware of the issue, and if they were aware of the issue, was it on a risk register, or had it been identified, and was there actually a plan in place as well? And that certainly when we first started having this conversation internally about how we would manage audit committee and management's expectations, there was quite a lot of nervousness around really calling into question people's ability to be a general manager or a senior leader within the business. And so we've really developed this slowly over time, working very closely with the business, trying then to get them to escalate stuff up, trying to be more proactive and understanding. But one of the things we're also looking at is really within this matrix environment, working with the business to find out where does the responsibility actually lie. So, instead of just firing the person who hasn't been operating the control room properly, or maybe breaching certain aspects, have they been trained properly? Is there the right process in place? So going through all these fairly detailed iterations until we can finally then talk, certainly first internally, sort of at our ExCo level, and then obviously reporting up to the audit committee as well. And it's an organisation as well where the control environment has been steadily improving, risk management steadily improving, and the organisation is looking for a little bit more consequence management, and that certainly makes people very nervous about how you can deal with that in a reasonable, measured and balanced way. Such that, we do have quite a lot of influence within the organisation, but certainly dealing with that in a very humble way, I think, pays dividends.
Mm-hmm. And Shobha, is that similar for kind of financial services around ensuring that risk management is it top of mind again as one of your top challenges?
Yeah, I would largely echo what Angela mentioned there, the focus on the self-assessments within the first line. What I would also say is we need to look beyond the headline to see what are those risks, what are those critical exposures which the audit committees are most concerned about. So if you look at the KPMG survey, if you think about the respondents, the organizations that have been surveyed, typically tend to have a very stable, mature risk management program. Mm-hmm. So the question perhaps we should be asking is, what has changed in the last 1.5 to 2 years that the senior leadership, the board, the audit committees are now less confident about the ongoing effectiveness of those practices, those programs? And I would say, in my view, the answer to that question somewhat relates to what we saw in the first session this morning, the scale of disruption. We talked about the fact that the technology and the business landscape around us is changing very quickly. Now we're seeing disruption to long-standing business models. We're seeing technology changes that are shaping, not just shaping, I would say reshaping the business strategy, consumer behavior, as Gunjan pointed out, the regulatory dialogue. And these are powerful changes. These are changes which are throwing up new opportunities. I see this in banking every day. we were talking earlier, we're competing with telecom providers. So as a bank, I'm not as worried about the larger organizations within similar offering. I'm more worried about telecom companies coming in and being able to undercut on whether it's Apple providing Apple Pay or so. There's huge amount of new opportunity. And think about artificial intelligence, robotic process automation, think about data science. But they're also exposing these organizations to a number of new risks. And these risks like cyber, use of social media, outdated business strategy. And really what's happening here is that the audit committees are feeling that their defense mechanisms, the risk management programs, have not kept pace with the changes that we're seeing around us. And that is a real concern, and that's a valid concern actually. So if I come back to your second question, which you asked earlier on, now how do we need to think about these changes around us and what should be the response from the audit function? I would say there are two areas to think about. The first being, show the leadership. I mean, we talked about leadership also a lot this morning, but have the leadership to stand up, to Janet's earlier point, have the courage to call it out when, as an audit function, we see that the risks that are being taken are outside our risk appetite. And that's a discussion that I haven't seen happening a few years back. This term about risk appetite, what is a risk appetite? And it's somewhat very difficult to say, what is my risk appetite for cyber incident tomorrow? But having a clearer understanding, bringing people around the table to understand what is our position and how do we avoid a surprise? How do we make sure that we're not surprised by any incident, any outcome that would cause us deep embarrassment to the organization? So having that understanding, calling it out. And the second thing I would offer here is, I do think with the changes we've seen in technology, the role of Chief Audit Executive hasn't changed a lot. But the tools and techniques available to us has changed significantly. So it's up to us to now use the new technologies. Gone are those days where we could take a sample of 25 and look at million transactions that are being processed every day. We need to embrace technology. We need to be able to use structured and unstructured data to look for those insights. And I'll give you an example. I mean, we were talking earlier about, predictive ability, not just a function that looks back. It's a common example, as an auditor, we would typically focus on operational errors. I mean, that's a lag indicator. We need to be thinking about lead indicators here, and big data has made that possible. Look at employee surveys. They tell us where there may be stress in the system, and use that information to form a holistic view. And that is the way forward, really, if you ask me.
So you finding that those kind of skill sets are more IT type skill sets that are being brought back into the audit function?
Well, I mean, I remember reading an article where somebody was asking if the auditor of tomorrow would be an engineer or a data scientist. No, really not. I don't think so. I would say the core skills, to Janet's earlier point, we need in a good auditor are still the same. There's a lot of value for being professional. Skepticism is absolutely key. Being able to conduct independent assessment is absolutely key. They are the bedrock of effective auditing. But what we do need to do is embrace the new skills, new technology. We should be able to use other tools that are available to us to look at things from a different viewpoint, connect the dots across the organizations as opposed to just look at a sample of 25, look at other things around us to see where things don't connect and call it out.
Yeah, interesting. Janet, do you have a view on that yourself?
I think we mentioned that the professional skills have improved, and I think we continue. We have a duty to work with the Institute of Internal Auditors to continue to develop out that professional capability so that audit as a profession is more widely recognised, which I think will help us with its marketability. I think it's one of the best kept secrets of the business world. Is the fantastic opportunities that exist within internal audit, but I don't know that we are able to advertise that particularly well, especially to a younger generation. So I definitely we need to build up that technical skill. We do need to have increasingly deep skills to understand some of the complexities of the organizations that we operate in. I was just sort of running through a quick list here of the kinds of things I know that we thought about at Citi, but the the need for somebody who can understand what's going on in high frequency trading on the one hand, or what's going on in PPI on the other, all within just the scope of the kind of business activities. But then you need to be thinking about modeling, capital management, information security, regulatory compliance, cyber, robotics, AI, data science, analytics. There's just a huge range of skills and capabilities that we need to be able to access, whether that comes from managing it in-house, which in larger organizations and financial services is blessed usually with much larger audit budgets than other organizations. Or you need to have access through partnerships with various third parties. But at the core, I think the ideas of skepticism, curiosity, the desire to get to the bottom of something, the fearlessness to ask the next question, good judgment, the ability to look at something top down and bottom up, are the capabilities that we need in the people that work in internal audit, and the ability to manage stakeholders. Auditors tend to find themselves punching above their weight quite a lot. You take relatively junior people and sit them down in front of fairly senior individuals, and then they start to criticize them. And that takes quite a lot of guts. And it also needs a lot of skill in the ability not to belligerently hammer home an idea, but the ability to actually change someone's mind, which is quite an elegant and hard to do thing. So there's just a real mix of those three things that you need in an audit department, which is one of the reasons why it's so fun to build one.
Yeah, no, I can imagine. I can imagine. And as that comes on to the last question, so we talked about it being much more kind of risk focused and what you need to do as an audit department to skill the team to be able to manage that. I suppose the last question, and maybe this is for yourself, Angela, is, what are the best practices that you've seen for successful audit programs?
So for me, it kind of starts with stakeholder management and really understanding the stakeholder community, mapping that out, and then utilising my team really to engage with the business. We've talked a lot about understanding what is going on within your business, and of course that's fundamentally key to really having exceptional business performance across it. Are you really looking at stuff that really matters? Are you doing it on a timely basis? Can you be proactive? And then when you encounter something where you might get a degree of challenge, or there might be a certain element of criticism, having those really good stakeholder relationships so that you can have, a conversation without someone hopefully becoming too defensive or trying to challenge. And I think, listening is absolutely key in terms of one of the skills that's absolutely essential, really to understand your stakeholders' perspective, even though you might not necessarily agree with their point of view, and making your voice heard is really important. I think it's really essential, and certainly one of the feedback that I got in my early auditing days was listen to their perspective, let them have their, set out their stall, and then engage with them on that level, and you'll make really great progress as well. And that's something that certainly as an audit team, when we get together, we'll always do some listening exercises, and it's quite interesting to see how quickly some of the auditors will jump into solution immediately, rather than really listening through those scenarios.
That's interesting. Actually, listening is a key thing. Steve, have you got any kind of comments on that as well?
Well, I'll build on that. I think when we talk about stakeholders, talk about stakeholder mapping, desperately important. But then you've got to remember to engage with the right stakeholders at the right time, because if you engage with them at the wrong time, that creates a problem. You run off to the chair of the audit committee and say, look what I found, before you've told the CEO or the CFO, you're in trouble. You wouldn't do that. So engagement at the right time. You've also got to tell stakeholders what they need to know. Sometimes they haven't quite clearly thought that through. So tell them what they need to know. Talk to them about what they need to know and understand it, but tell them what they need to know. Don't tell them everything you've done, because if that is the case, they'll get lost in the noise. There's a lot of things we do, but there are only a smaller number of things that we actually need to tell people about. You need also to show your stakeholders that you're looking at the areas that really matter. That's going to come through risk, of course. And by looking at the areas that really matter, you've got to make sure that A, you've got the capacity, so you don't spread too thin. You don't rush in and say, I've looked at something and it took me 2 hours to look at it, and therefore here's a level of assurance. That's a very dangerous thing to do. So make sure you've got the capacity, and also make sure you've got the capability as well. And if you have to source the capability externally, that's not a problem. If you aren't prepared to do that and you lack the skills internally, you shouldn't actually do the work. It's very important not to do that. False assurance is a disaster for our profession. Technology, we've talked about technology. Use technology to sharpen your focus and save time. Simplistically, all those years ago when I started out in the profession, I used to get on to an aeroplane or a train or in the back of my car with a pilot's case full of paperwork. Don't do that anymore. The teams don't do that. They go out with a laptop or technology just to be able to document. From the other end, looking at whole data sets. So when you arrive at site, having analysed what you needed to analyse, you go in and say, I want to see 3 things, please. That's all I care about, 3 things. Don't give me a sample of 60. 3 questions I've got for you today. Hugely powerful, massive opportunity to save management's time, which is precious, save your time, which is equally precious. We as a team of professionals need also to stay open-minded. Don't become fixed in what we do. What we do today is probably right, but it may not be right tomorrow. So always be on the lookout for better ways of operating, being smarter, giving your organisations more for the same or a lower price. That's terribly important as well. If we're going to go in and criticise other people's budgetary control, one aspect of what we may do, then we better make sure our budgetary control is really, really sharp and better than pretty much anyone else's. But in doing that, in being introspective, never close the shop. Don't say we're out of business for 6 months, but we'll come back even better in the future. Keep going, keep improving, incremental change. That's what we're looking for as a function. So there's some of the things.
Yeah, that's been really interesting. I suppose I'm just very conscious of time, and that we can continue this discussion for many, many more hours, but I'm just interested, are there any questions from the team as to kind of any questions that you want to pose the panel that we have? Uh-huh.
I'll ask a question. I work in operational risk, so in the second line. So I've been listening to you for the last 15, 20 minutes. I mean, I could have written the script myself for the second line. It was all tick, tick, tick. So what's your difference as the third line versus the second line?
I don't know who wants to take that question.
Well, it's a great question, because I actually manage risk as well as audit. And so we changed the risk management process significantly 3 years ago. And definitely in terms of reviewing that process, we will get somebody externally to come and look in. And in a small organisation, it's actually been quite advantageous to pull the two together to make sure that the auditors really understand the risks, but equally then segment the team so that we've got a couple of people really focused on risk management, working with the business at all kinds of levels as well. And then really challenging the auditors, and that's really, really important to the focus of their audits, and that they're really managing risk. So the dynamics work well together. Yes, I think we could separate them now, but certainly in terms of really driving both sort of functional specialisms, it's been really advantageous pulling the two together as well. Did that kind of answer your question?
I'll just say briefly, I don't think audit can be effective without an effective second or first line, because otherwise, what are you going to do? I also used to facilitate risk management when I was with Sab Miller. And what drives audit? Audit is driven by a review of the effectiveness of the identification and sizing up and then management of risk. Now, we can't have an audit function that comes along to management and says, here's my plan for the next year, and it's based on these risks. And management say, that's very interesting. What are these risks? I've never seen them before. That's because your risk management, process management is rubbish, and I'm the auditor, and I know truly where the risks are, and therefore my view of risk is better than yours. It's a completely useless state of affairs. Internal audit's objective, one of the most fundamental objectives, is the same as everybody else's. We want our organisations to be as effective, as successful as they can possibly be. In the right way. And so we do rely on risk management as a second line activity to enable us to do our jobs.
So I originally became an auditor in organisations without structured risk management functions. And so the expectation was internal audit would find the stuff because it wasn't anybody else's job to find anything. I think as risk management has evolved and embedded itself into organisations, that has changed substantially, and now the expectation is internal audit comes in and shouldn't be finding any stuff because it's the job of everybody else to do that. So I think perhaps what we're experiencing is the migration of some of the skills that would have sat over on the right-hand side deeper into the organisation, and we're at a point where we haven't quite figured out exactly where the lines start and finish. I know that's certainly the case in my organisation, and I've seen that in others. So, but I think a lot of the capabilities are now common throughout everybody. The expectations that everybody's a risk manager, and everybody's looking for where the issues are.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. I'm just very conscious of time again. I think we could be sitting here for a number of hours reviewing this topic. But thank you very much for everyone's participation, and I want to say thank you to the panel members as well. Thank you.